In the middle of England's bloody civil wars, there was one woman who seemed to drift quietly through the storm. She left behind no letters, no fiery speeches, no recorded words that could echo across the centuries. Yet she was the daughter of one of the most powerful men of her age, the bride of a prince, and finally the queen of a king whose name still stirs fierce debate. Her life reads like a shadow story, often overlooked, often dismissed, but always present at the heart of events that shaped the crown of England. Her name was Anne Neville. For centuries she has been remembered as the tragic queen of Richard III, frail and meek, a woman with little agency in a world ruled by ruthless men. But what if that image is only half the truth? What if Anne's silence in the records is not evidence of weakness, but instead a mask that concealed a sharper mind and a more resilient will than we have ever imagined? What if, behind the great battles and political upheavals of the Wars of the Roses, she was making quiet moves of her own, moves that helped decide the fate of a dynasty? In this video, we are going to uncover the hidden depths of Anne Neville. We will trace her journey from a daughter in the house of the Kingmaker, through her forced marriage into the Lancastrian line, to her rise as Duchess of Gloucester and then Queen of England. Along the way, we will ask new questions. Was she really a pawn, or was she a subtle player in the Game of Thrones that consumed her world? And why have historians been so quick to overlook her story? Welcome to Words of Time, and in this video we will explore the life of Anne Neville, the forgotten queen whose legacy may be far more complex and far more intriguing than history has led us to believe. Anne Neville has often been described in history books as a shadowy figure, quiet and pliant, a woman who seemed to drift from father to husband, then to another husband, with little agency of her own. She has been portrayed in fiction, and even in some academic work, as meek, tragic, and perhaps most importantly, as a pawn in the greater games of powerful men around her. That image has stuck because it fits neatly into the story of the Wars of the Roses. A daughter of the formidable Earl of Warwick, married first to the son of Henry VI, and later to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who would become Richard III. In both cases, she appears as someone whose destiny was arranged by others. Yet what if this is only part of the story? What if Anne Neville, often overshadowed by louder voices and more flamboyant figures of her time, had hidden depths? Her life, when studied closely, gives us reason to question the standard account. She was not only the daughter of the most powerful earl in England, but also someone trained to survive in a world of constant political maneuvering. And although the records we have are limited, there are moments and subtle clues that suggest she was far more than just a passive player. England in the 15th century was torn apart by civil war between two rival houses, York and Lancaster. Loyalties shifted constantly. Power was fragile, and survival often depended on strategic marriages and alliances. Anne Neville was born into this environment in the year 1456, the younger daughter of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, who was famously called the Kingmaker. Her father earned that title because he played a decisive role in deposing one king and helping to install another. From birth, Anne was tied to this high-stakes world. Unlike many noble daughters who might have lived more quietly on estates, she grew up in the center of conflict, surrounded by discussions of power, military campaigns, and the calculations of advantage. Her early life was not just about comfort or embroidery in the household of a great lord. She would have been taught to understand her family's alliances, to recognize her position as a valuable figure in the political chessboard, and to cultivate the poise expected of a noblewoman who could be married into power. Warwick, ambitious and relentless, likely ensured his daughters were prepared for roles that extended beyond the domestic. Anne's older sister, Isabel, was married to George, Duke of Clarence, brother of Edward IV. Anne herself was married to Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales and son of Henry VI. These were not accidents of fate. These were careful moves in a world where noble daughters were instruments of strategy. The word pawn is often used in describing Anne Neville, but that metaphor is not entirely fair. A pawn in chess has no power except what others decide for it. And by contrast, grew up in a household where she was trained to be useful, adaptable, and aware. That kind of environment leaves a mark. It does not create someone who simply accepts her place, but someone who learns how to read situations, when to bend, and when to act. This is where the hidden depths of Anne Neville begin to appear. She knew her role, but she also knew the stakes, and there are instances that show she could maneuver within the limits set upon her. Her first marriage to Prince Edward has been cited as evidence that she was nothing more than a bargaining chip. Yet it is worth asking what it took for a young woman to step into that role. Prince Edward had been raised in exile with his mother, Margaret of Anjou, and was known for his fiery temperament. Their marriage was meant to seal an alliance between Warwick and Margaret, two figures who had once been bitter enemies. For Anne, this was not a simple matter of being handed over. She had to live in a court that had been in conflict with her family, adapt to a new environment, and build a place for herself beside a husband with his own strong character. The chroniclers of the time mention her little, but silence should not be confused with irrelevance. Surviving in such a marriage required resilience and skill. When Prince Edward was killed at the Battle of Tewkesbury in 1471 and was left a widow in her mid-teens, the story then usually shifts quickly to her marriage to Richard, Duke of Gloucester, but the in-between moment is crucial. According to some accounts, she was placed under the control of her brother-in-law George, Duke of Clarence, who sought to keep her inheritance and perhaps her person within his power. It is here that hints of Anne's strength surface. Richard sought to marry her, but Clarence resisted because marrying her would divide the Warwick estates. For a time, Anne was hidden, even according to some later tales kept disguised in a London shop to prevent the match. While the details are uncertain, what is clear is that Anne did not disappear from the stage. She eventually married Richard, and to reach that point must have navigated the treacherous rivalry between two brothers who were capable of violence and betrayal even against kin. It is often said that Richard rescued Anne, that he found her and freed her from Clarence's control. That interpretation casts her as passive once more. Yet one must also consider that Anne agreed to the marriage. She had a choice, even if limited. Aligning with Richard meant placing herself beside the brother who was gaining favor with King Edward IV, and who had a reputation for loyalty at that time. Marrying him was not only an emotional decision but a rational one, the move of a woman who recognized which side of the family quarrel offered more security. By choosing Richard, she shaped her path in a way that helped her survive the deadly politics of the day. Her years with Richard are usually described as quiet, but they reveal further signs of hidden depth. As Duchess of Gloucester, she managed estates, held household authority, and took on responsibilities that were far from trivial. Later, as queen consort, she had to navigate court politics where factions watched her every move. Her health may have been fragile, but she still appeared in processions, acted in public rituals, and gave legitimacy to Richard's reign. Chroniclers hostile to Richard later painted her as a sickly, fading figure, yet those same sources were eager to diminish anything that might reflect well on him. Her presence as queen, though brief, was important in stabilizing Richard's position after he seized the crown. Some subtle clues also suggest she was more engaged in decision-making than we often assume. For instance, records indicate she involved herself in patronage, petitions, and religious foundations. These were traditional roles for queens, but they were also means of building networks of loyalty. To dismiss them as insignificant is to overlook how influence operated in that world. Moreover, when her only son, Edward of Middleham, was made Prince of Wales, Anne's role as mother of the heir strengthened Richard's legitimacy. She participated in the ceremonial aspects that broadcast their dynasty's authority, and that participation was itself a political act. The tragic death of their son in 1484 shattered both Anne and Richard, and it marked a turning point in their reign. Later rumors claimed Richard contemplated setting Anne aside to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. These stories have been used to portray Anne as powerless, a queen abandoned. But the truth is less clear. Contemporary sources note that Anne continued to appear in public with Richard, and when she died in March 1485, her death was treated with solemn ceremony. Whether Richard did or did not consider another marriage, Anne remained queen until the end of her life, which speaks to her continued relevance even in decline. Looking back across her story, what emerges is a portrait not of a pawn, but of a survivor. Anne Neville lived in a world where women's voices were rarely recorded, especially if they did not leave behind letters or speeches. Her silence in the sources has allowed later generations to project weakness onto her. Yet the evidence, scattered though it is, suggests a different picture. A girl trained from birth in the household of the Kingmaker, a young woman who adapted to life at the Lancastrian court, a widow who navigated the rivalries of Clarence and Richard, a duchess who managed estates, and a queen who upheld her husband's regime. These are not the marks of someone meek. They are the signs of someone who understood her role and worked within it to endure. When historians describe Anne Neville as a pawn, They often forget that pawns in chess can reach the other side of the board and become queens. Anne's life mirrors that in an almost literal sense. She began as the daughter used for alliances, but she ended as Queen of England. The journey was not smooth, and her reign was short, but her path shows agency and decision-making at critical moments. She was not loud, not flamboyant, but quiet strength is no less strength. Her hidden depths are found not in dramatic gestures, but in persistence, in choices made when options were few, in the capacity to endure when others fell. Many figures of the Wars of the Roses were destroyed by their ambition, yet and managed to survive long enough to reach the crown. That survival was not an accident. It was the result of a sharp mind trained by her father's world, a keen awareness of shifting power, and the ability to move carefully through dangerous circumstances. And Neville deserves to be remembered not just as a wife of Prince Edward or of Richard III, but as a figure who embodied resilience in a brutal age. Her life reminds us that history often overlooks those who work quietly, whose influence is subtle, and whose strength is expressed in endurance rather than in noise. The meek pawn of traditional narratives fades when we read between the lines, and in her place stands a woman of hidden depths who deserves recognition for her own story. And Neville's story does not end with the idea of hidden depths. To see her fully, one has to follow her through the web of forced marriages, broken allegiances, and subtle maneuvers that made her more than the pale, fragile figure described by chroniclers who were often hostile or indifferent to her. She was Warwick the Kingmaker's daughter, and if his legacy was one of bold gambles and political engineering, her life reflected a quieter but equally deliberate engagement with the game of power. She lived through arrangements that on the surface made her a victim, but underneath those arrangements, her responses reveal a woman who could calculate and adjust, who could bend with events but never break entirely. To frame her only as a pawn ignores the way she absorbed the lessons of her father's household and used them to maintain her place in a world where others fell violently. The first striking example comes with her marriage to Edward of Westminster, the Lancastrian heir. At first glance, this appears to be the definition of forced marriage. Anne, still little more than a girl, was given to the son of Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou in order to secure an alliance between Warwick and his former enemy. This was a desperate political move on Warwick's part, who had turned against the Yorkist Edward IV after once placing him on the throne. For Anne, it meant being delivered into the hands of a family that had long opposed her father. The picture usually painted is one of helplessness. The kingmaker deciding her fate, Margaret of Anjou welcoming a bride for her son, and then reduced to a bargaining token. Yet even in this situation, there are clues that she was not entirely without influence. Consider what was required of her in that marriage. Margaret of Anjou was a forceful, proud queen, and Edward of Westminster had been raised with the conviction that he was the rightful heir to England's crown. To stand beside such figures, and needed more than obedience. She needed to present herself as a worthy consort, to support the Lancastrian cause with outward loyalty, and to fit into a court whose survival depended on fragile alliances. No records of her words survive, but the absence of scandal or disruption suggests she managed the task. A girl who had grown up in Warwick's household would have known that marriages were more than personal unions. They were performances of loyalty. By performing well, and did not just serve her father's strategy, she created a role for herself in which she was accepted by Margaret and her son, and that acceptance gave her some room to maneuver. Her situation shifted drastically after the Battle of Tewkesbury, when her husband was killed and the Lancastrian cause collapsed. Here, Anne's ability to adapt becomes clear. She had been a Lancastrian princess in name, but when that world was destroyed, she did not vanish with it. Instead, she faced a new struggle, caught between her sister Isabel's husband, George, Duke of Clarence, and his younger brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Clarence wanted to keep her unmarried, for if she remained single, her share of the Neville inheritance might eventually fall to his control. Richard, however, sought her hand in marriage, partly from affection, partly from strategy. Anne was young, widowed, and politically valuable, but she was not inert. The rivalry between the brothers over her person was not only about wealth, but also about her own willingness to accept or refuse. The story that Richard found her hidden away in London, perhaps disguised in a shop, may contain embellishments, but it speaks to the recognition that Anne was not passively waiting. Whether she resisted Clarence's attempts to confine her or actively sought out Richard's protection, she was taking part in the contest over her fate. When she agreed to marry Richard, she was doing more than following her heart. She was making a calculated choice. Richard was the brother whose loyalty to Edward IV was stronger, whose reputation was less tainted by betrayal, and who showed genuine concern for her situation. By aligning with him, and positioned herself with the safer of the two brothers, and in doing so, she secured her independence from Clarence's grasp. That was not the act of a pawn. It was the move of someone weighing her chances and choosing carefully. Her marriages, then, show a pattern of adaptation. She was given to Edward of Westminster as a teenager, and she fulfilled that role in a way that kept her safe until the tide turned. When that role ended violently, she shifted to Richard, whose alliance offered stability and a share in his rising fortunes. Forced marriages might seem to erase a woman's will, but in Anne's case, she made those circumstances work for her survival. She was not free to choose from a wide field, yet within the narrow confines available, she displayed awareness and calculation. The apparent contradiction of being first a Lancastrian ally and then a Yorkist queen has often been used as proof of Anne's passivity. How could one person reconcile being wife to the Lancastrian prince and later consort to the Yorkist king who had been his rival? The answer lies not in inconsistency, but in the way and understood politics. Loyalty in 15th-century England was rarely fixed. Her father himself shifted from Yorkist kingmaker to Lancastrian ally when his position demanded it, and had learned in her youth that allegiance was less about eternal devotion and more about survival and opportunity. As a Lancastrian, she stood as the bride of Edward of Westminster, a symbol of the alliance meant to restore Henry VI. That cause ended with defeat. At that point, she did not cling to a dead loyalty that could only bring ruin. Instead, by marrying Richard, she aligned with the Yorkist side that still held power. This was not betrayal but realism. It was consistency of a different kind, the consistency of survival, of recognizing where the center of power lay and adapting to it. Anne's strategic thread was not tied to one faction, but to her determination to remain relevant in whichever faction prevailed. Her later role as Duchess of Gloucester and then Queen of England shows how she built upon this strategy. As Richard's wife, she lent legitimacy to his position, not only because of her noble blood, but because of her connections to both Lancastrian and Yorkist lines. That dual heritage allowed Richard to bridge divisions, at least temporarily, and Anne was central to that balancing act. She embodied the reconciliation of once rival claims, and in that embodiment, she played a quiet but essential part in Richard's grasp of the throne. Her influence behind the scenes, though uncredited in most chronicles, can be detected in several ways. First, her presence in Richard's household as Duchess of Gloucester was more than decorative. She managed estates, dispensed patronage, and oversaw charitable works. In the 15th century, these activities were not trivial. They were means of shaping loyalty, of binding people to the household. Second, her close relationship with her sister Isabel meant she was often entangled in Clarence's turbulent career. When Clarence fell from favor and was eventually executed, Anne's position as Richard's wife placed her at the center of family tensions that could easily have endangered her. Yet she emerged intact, which suggests she navigated those tensions with skill. Even more telling is her role during the early years of Richard's reign. After he claimed the crown and appeared publicly at his side, crowned queen in a lavish ceremony that reinforced his legitimacy. The symbolism of her presence mattered. She was Warwick's daughter, the widow of the Lancastrian prince, and the sister-in-law of Edward IV. Each identity tied Richard to different strands of noble blood, and in every appearance, and silently affirmed those connections. This was influence without speeches or proclamations, but it was influence nonetheless. In examining her life as Warwick's daughter, one sees how deeply she had absorbed her father's style of politics. Warwick was a master manipulator, arranging marriages, switching allegiances, and making daring moves that earned him his title as the Kingmaker. And did not act on such a grand scale, but within her limited sphere, she mirrored that same instinct for adjustment. Where Warwick bet his fortunes on the battlefield and at court, and staked hers on personal choices and careful positioning. Her victories were not loud but measured, surviving widowhood, overcoming Clarence's obstruction, becoming queen. It is tempting to read, and as a figure swept along by currents larger than herself. But when one looks closely, her decisions reveal the steady hand of someone trained in strategy. She was not the author of wars or the maker of kings, but she was the one who turned forced marriages into footholds, contradictions into consistency, and background roles into quiet but vital influence. She did not shout her power from the rooftops. She lived it, in every adjustment, every alliance, every act of survival. And Neville's life invites us to reconsider what power looks like in history. It is not always the loud voice or the bold gesture. Sometimes it is the hidden depth of a woman who appeared meek, but who understood the game as well as any man around her, and who played it in her own way, surviving where others perished. Her story, far from being that of a mere pawn, is the story of a kingmaker's daughter who learned the rules of the Game of Thrones and mastered the art of survival within them. And Neville's journey from the uncertain position of a young widow to the throne of England is often summarized in a few brief sentences in traditional accounts. But when one examines the thread of her life more closely, this part of her story holds as much complexity and quiet determination as her earlier struggles. Having survived her father's gamble in marrying her to the Lancastrian heir, and then the bitter contest between Richard and George over her second marriage, she moved into a new role as Duchess of Gloucester. From there, the path would lead her to become Queen of England, but it was not a smooth or inevitable progression. The transformation from reluctant Duchess to crowned Queen unfolded through a mixture of calculated choices, deep personal bonds, and the unrelenting demands of politics. In this phase of her life, the enigma of her marriage to Richard, the political shifts that allowed their rise, and the burdens that accompanied the crown all reveal once more that and was far from the silent figure many imagine. Her marriage to Richard has often been examined as either a romantic love match or a cold political calculation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, and to deny Anne's role in shaping it is to ignore the evidence of her earlier resilience. Richard, the youngest brother of Edward IV, had shown loyalty to his brother and built a reputation for capable governance in the north. Unlike Clarence, Richard seemed to genuinely value and some accounts even suggest affection between them that went beyond the needs of politics. Yet the marriage also made strategic sense. By marrying Anne, Richard secured access to her portion of the Neville inheritance, strengthened his claim to land and wealth, and established himself more firmly among the magnates of the realm. For Anne, the choice of Richard was also layered. She had little reason to trust Clarence, who had tried to keep her confined and cut her out of her inheritance. Richard, by contrast, was willing to fight for her hand, and his insistence suggested both personal attachment and political clarity. In agreeing to the marriage, Anne was not simply surrendering. She was choosing the option that gave her independence from Clarence, respect within the family, and security for her future. Whether love grew out of shared experience or was present from the beginning, what cannot be denied is that their union was more than a mere arrangement. They seemed to complement each other, Richard with his drive and authority, and with her quiet steadiness and noble pedigree. The years as Duchess of Gloucester reveal a partnership that was not simply ceremonial. Richard administered the north of England with energy and fairness, earning loyalty from local gentry, and Anne was at his side, managing household affairs and extending patronage in her own right. Their shared residence at Middleham Castle became a center of authority, and Anne's presence there was integral. She was not merely waiting in the background. She was participating in the maintenance of their regional power. The marriage provided stability for her after years of uncertainty, but it also set the stage for something greater when the Yorkist dynasty began to fracture. The turning point came with the death of Edward IV in April 1483. The sudden loss of the king created a vacuum of authority, for his son and heir Edward V was only 12 years old. Into that void stepped Richard, named Lord Protector. The events that followed remain some of the most debated in English history. The arrests of powerful figures of the Woodville family, the placement of the young king and his brother in the Tower, and Richard's eventual claim to the crown. Through all of this, Anne stood as the Duchess of Gloucester, watching as her husband maneuvered from loyal uncle to crowned king. It is easy to focus entirely on Richard in these months, but Anne's role should not be dismissed. Her presence was essential in legitimizing the new regime. As Warwick's daughter, she embodied the lineage of one of the most powerful noble families of the century. As mother to their son, Edward of Middleham, she offered continuity for the future. When Richard took the throne in June 1483 and was crowned alongside him, and that joint coronation was not an afterthought. It symbolized the unity of their rule, within providing the necessary dignity and connection to the Neville legacy that Richard alone could not claim. The coronation itself was a carefully staged event, filled with pageantry that underscored their authority, and rode through London with Richard in grand procession, and the imagery emphasized her role as queen consort. Far from being a silent figure in the background, she was displayed to the people as an essential part of the new monarchy. The choice to crown her at the same time as Richard was deliberate. It presented them as a united pair, and it reinforced the legitimacy of Richard's reign at a moment when questions and doubts swirled around the disappearance of the young princes. Anne's crown symbolized not just her personal elevation, but the political necessity of showing a complete royal household to the nation. Yet with the crown came heavy burdens. The position of queen consort in medieval England was demanding even under stable circumstances, and for Anne, the circumstances were anything but stable. She was expected to maintain the dignity of the throne, to participate in religious rituals, to extend patronage to nobles and commoners alike, and to provide heirs to secure the dynasty. The last of these duties weighed most heavily, for her only son, Edward of Middleham, was fragile in health. His death in early 1484 dealt a crushing blow both personally and politically. For Anne, it was the loss of her child. For Richard, it was the collapse of his dynasty's future. Even before her son's death, and faced the pressures of public scrutiny. Every action of the queen consort was a statement, whether in her appearance at ceremonies, her choices in patronage, or her visible support of her husband. She had to embody loyalty, piety, and fertility, all while whispers and rumors surrounded the legitimacy of Richard's claim. When she appeared beside him at events, she was a living counter to those doubts, a symbol that his reign had the blessing of a queen and a line of descent. But the very act of embodying that role came at a cost. Ill health plagued her, and the strain of repeated losses. First her first husband, then her father, then her brother-in-law Clarence, and finally her son, must have taken a toll that even a crown could not ease. Her position was further complicated by the persistent rumors that Richard intended to set her aside in order to marry his niece, Elizabeth of York. These tales, spread by hostile chroniclers and perhaps amplified by court intrigue, painted Anne as a queen about to be discarded. Whether there was truth in those rumors remains uncertain, but what is certain is that Anne did not fade into irrelevance. She continued to appear with Richard publicly, even as her health declined. Her endurance in maintaining her role despite such gossip speaks again to her resilience. She had always adapted, from Lancastrian princess to Yorkist duchess to queen, and even in her final year, she continued to fulfill her duties. The burdens of the crown were not only personal but political. The shadow of the missing princes hung over Richard's reign, and every attempt to secure loyalty required careful calculation. Anne's queenship was part of that calculation. Through her, Richard could draw on the memory of Warwick's power and on the legitimacy of their joint coronation. Through her, he could present the image of a settled monarchy, even when events threatened to unravel it. The fact that chroniclers often overlooked her voice does not diminish the impact of her presence. In a world where appearance and symbolism mattered deeply, and steady fulfillment of her role was vital to Richard's hold on the throne. Her death in March 1485 ended her brief queenship and removed one of the stabilizing elements of Richard's rule. The timing, so close to the crisis of Bosworth Field later that year, only deepened the sense of a dynasty unraveling. Yet her life until that point shows not a passive figure, but a woman who had navigated forced marriages, shifting allegiances, and the crushing demands of queenship with a persistence that speaks of quiet strength. And Neville's passage from reluctant duchess to crowned queen reveals again the hidden depths of her character. Her marriage to Richard was neither simple romance nor cold strategy alone, but a union that held elements of both. Her coronation was not merely a ceremony, but the culmination of years of adaptation, and her queenship was marked not by ease, but by unrelenting pressure. In each stage, she endured, just as she had in earlier chapters of her life. The crown weighed heavily, but she bore it until the end, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy of resilience that history has too often overlooked. And Neville's story, when traced from her earliest years to her queenship, has already shown that she was far more than the passive pawn history has often made her out to be. She began as the daughter of the Kingmaker, was thrust into marriages that seemed designed purely for others' gain, and yet each time she adapted, making choices that ensured her survival and ultimately her rise to the throne of England. As queen, she bore the weight of expectation and loss, supporting Richard III through one of the most turbulent reigns of the late medieval period. But her legacy cannot be measured only by what is written in chronicles or by the limited public roles that were recorded. Much of her influence was unseen, existing in the quiet corridors of power, the intimate spaces of council, and the symbolic presence she carried as Warwick's daughter, Richard's queen, and the mother of a boy meant to secure the future of the Plantagenet line. The image of Anne as a forgotten regent is not a modern invention, but the product of centuries of selective storytelling. Chroniclers of her time had little interest in exploring the agency of women unless those women defied expectations in shocking or scandalous ways. Queens who were pious and dutiful often vanished into the margins of history, their contributions ignored, and fit into that category for many observers. She was not loud, nor did she wield open authority as Margaret of Anjou had done during Henry VI's troubled reign. But to assume she was powerless is to misunderstand how influence operated in the 15th century. Anne's position as queen consort carried responsibilities that extended far beyond ceremonial duties. She was expected to intercede with the king on behalf of petitioners, to recommend appointments, to oversee patronage networks, and to sponsor religious institutions. These roles, though couched in the language of piety and service, were fundamentally political. Every grant she supported, every petitioner she recommended, was a means of strengthening loyalty to the crown. Surviving records, though limited, suggest that she did indeed exercise these functions, providing relief for subjects and ensuring that Richard's regime projected an image of fairness and generosity. Such acts may not seem dramatic, but they were crucial in binding together a fragile monarchy. There is reason to believe that Anne's counsel mattered to Richard himself. Their marriage, forged in shared trials, had developed into a partnership that seemed to hold mutual respect. Richard, unlike some kings, had not dismissed his wife as irrelevant, and his decision to have her crowned at the same time as himself in June 1483 underscores this. It was a conscious choice to present them as a united force. In private, and likely played a role in shaping his policies, especially those concerning the north of England, where they had governed together for years before taking the throne. The trust Richard placed in her judgment during those years at Middleham would not simply vanish once they were crowned. The tragedy of her queenship, however, lies most of all in her role as mother. The birth of her son Edward of Middleham offered her the greatest hope, the promise of securing the dynasty for the future. For a queen, motherhood was not only personal but deeply political. Producing an heir cemented the legitimacy of the royal line, reassured the nobility, and quieted dissent. Anne's aspirations for her son must have been immense. She had seen the devastation of dynastic struggle firsthand, from her first marriage to the Lancastrian prince whose claim was destroyed at Tewkesbury to the conflicts between her brothers-in-law. For her, Edward was more than a child. He was the embodiment of stability, the key to securing the legacy of both her family and her husband's. The ceremony in which Edward of Middleham was made Prince of Wales reflected this ambition, and took part in the celebration, presenting him as the future king in a way that carried both maternal pride and political weight. It was the culmination of her role as queen consort, not only to support her husband, but to ensure continuity for the realm. For a brief time, it seemed as though all the turbulence of her past had been vindicated, that her endurance through widowhood, rivalry, and political upheaval had brought her to this moment of triumph. Then came the devastating blow. In the early months of 1484, Edward died, likely of sudden illness, leaving his parents bereft and the dynasty in peril. For Anne, the loss was unbearable. She had lost her father, her first husband, her siblings' support, and now her only child. Her grief was not just maternal but also political. The dream of securing her son's future as king was shattered, and with it, the security of her husband's reign. Chroniclers note that both Anne and Richard were stricken by despair, their sorrow evident to all. For a queen who had invested her life in the survival of her family line, this loss must have felt like the erasure of all her sacrifices. The death of Edward also created a dangerous void at the heart of Richard's monarchy. Without a clear heir, the regime appeared unstable, and whispers began to circulate about Richard seeking to remarry or adopt a successor. Anne's influence during this period, though obscured by rumors, may have been crucial in keeping the monarchy from unraveling altogether. Her continued presence at Richard's side, even as her health faltered, lent dignity and stability to a court rocked by uncertainty. Though she could not replace the lost heir, she could still embody the legitimacy of the crown, her Neville blood and her shared reign with Richard serving as a reminder of continuity. Anne's unseen influence can also be traced through the ways she shaped the immediate future of the Plantagenet dynasty. While her own life ended in March 1485, only months before Richard's downfall at Bosworth, her quiet work as queen had already left its mark. The network she built through patronage and intercession did not disappear with her death. Many of those bonds endured, shaping loyalties that played out even after the fall of Richard. Her symbolic role as Warwick's daughter also lingered in memory, for the Kingmaker's legacy continued to resonate long after his death. By embodying that connection, and had reinforced Richard's position and tied the Neville prestige to the Yorkist cause. One might argue that her actions were modest compared to the grand designs of kings and generals, but history is not made only by bold strokes. It is also shaped by the quieter architects who sustain regimes, uphold legitimacy, and ensure that the machinery of court continues to function. And was such a figure. She was not the strategist who launched armies, but she was the queen who gave Richard's monarchy its human face, who embodied dynastic unity, and who bore the unbearable weight of dynastic hope in her son. In these ways, she helped to shape the immediate course of English politics, even if she did not live to see its ultimate conclusion. The perception of Anne Neville as meek and passive has long obscured these truths. It is easier to write her off as the tragic queen who faded away than to confront the complexity of her influence. But to do so is to strip away her humanity and her significance. She was a woman of her time, constrained by the limits placed upon her, yet within those limits, she carved out a role that was vital. She navigated marriages that others arranged, but she made them serve her survival. She shifted allegiances, but always with an eye to endurance and security. She endured the crown not as a luxury, but as a burden, one she bore until the end. Her legacy, though obscured, remains. It is found in the survival strategies she employed, in the networks she nurtured, and in the way she lent legitimacy to one of the most contested reigns of the 15th century. It is found in the memory of a mother who placed all her hopes in a son who died too young, and in the strength of a queen who held her place even as the world around her collapsed. Above all, it is found in the quiet resilience of a woman who was never simply a pawn, but rather a subtle player whose influence, though unseen, helped to shape the course of her dynasty in its final days. And Neville's life was not long, and her reign as queen was brief, but her story offers a profound lesson in the forms that power can take. Influence is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is the steady presence of a queen consort who embodies legitimacy, the intercessions of a wife on behalf of her husband's subjects, the aspirations of a mother for her child, and the endurance of a woman who lived through loss after loss, yet continued to fulfill her role. These are the marks of Anne Neville's legacy, a legacy too often forgotten, but essential to understanding the final chapter of the Plantagenet dynasty. Anne Neville's story, if left in the hands of the chroniclers who lived during or just after her time, is reduced to a simple, almost skeletal outline. She appears in their accounts as the daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker, as the bride of Edward of Westminster, as the wife of Richard Duke of Gloucester, and finally as the queen who faded quickly and left no surviving heirs. This bare summary strips her of personality, judgment, or any sense of agency. It leaves us with a tragic queen who seemed always to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, doomed to become a footnote to the ambitions of greater figures. Yet when her life is reconstructed carefully, following the threads of her marriages, her alliances, and her conduct as queen, another portrait emerges, and was far from a silent pawn. She was intelligent, resilient, and capable of adapting to the brutal realities of a civil war-torn realm. To reclaim her narrative is to challenge the narrow ways history has treated not only her, but also women like her, who played essential roles in their world, yet were remembered primarily for their silence. To see Anne as more than a tragic queen requires a shift in perspective. At first glance, she seems defined by loss. The death of her father, the death of her first husband, the death of her only child, and finally her own early death before she reached 30 years of age. This succession of tragedies has colored her image so strongly that even modern readers feel the weight of melancholy when they hear her name. But Anne's significance does not lie only in what she suffered. It lies in how she responded to circumstances, in the decisions she made within the confines of her world, and in the resilience she displayed when confronted with relentless upheaval. As a girl, Anne was trained in the household of the Kingmaker, where the art of survival was second nature. She was prepared for the reality that her marriage would be a political tool, and when that moment came, she did not falter. She stepped into her role as the bride of Edward of Westminster, enduring the challenge of entering a hostile court. When that role collapsed with his death, she did not fade into obscurity but aligned herself with Richard, a decision that was as pragmatic as it was personal. Later, as Duchess of Gloucester, she carved out a role in regional governance alongside her husband, showing that she could sustain a household of political importance. Finally, as queen, she performed the rituals of legitimacy with grace even while weighed down by grief and poor health. In each stage, she responded not with passivity but with careful adaptation. Historians, however, have long struggled to give her this credit. The problem lies not in the absence of evidence alone, but in the expectations placed upon queens. Margaret of Anjou, for instance, was remembered vividly because she broke boundaries, leading armies and asserting authority in ways that shocked contemporaries. Anne Neville, by contrast, did not defy the framework of queenship. She worked within it. She exercised influence through patronage, through her presence, and through her support of Richard's rule. Such methods were subtle, easily overlooked by chroniclers who valued military feats and dramatic gestures. The result is that her power seems invisible, and invisibility is too often mistaken for weakness. Yet to dismiss her because she did not act like Margaret of Anjou is to misunderstand the range of political agency available to women in the 15th century. Not every queen could or should have led armies. Influence was also found in shaping loyalty networks, in lending legitimacy to a regime, and in the daily reinforcement of dynastic stability, and embodied these roles. Her intelligence was evident in her ability to align with Richard rather than Clarence, in her acceptance of the shifting tides of allegiance, and in her understanding of how her presence could strengthen the monarchy. Her resilience shone in her capacity to endure repeated loss while continuing to fulfill her duties as queen. These are not the marks of a passive figure. They are the qualities of a woman who understood her world and navigated it with skill. The failure to recognize Anne's agency reveals as much about our historical blinders as it does about her. Historians, especially in earlier centuries, often valued narratives of conquest, bold leadership, and overt displays of power. They overlooked the quieter forms of influence that operated behind the scenes. Women like Anne, who did not fit the mold of dramatic actors, were dismissed as irrelevant. This approach reflects a limited understanding of power, one that equates visibility with importance and noise with impact. But history is not only made by the loudest voices. It is also shaped by those who work steadily, by those who endure and adapt, by those who sustain institutions in times of uncertainty. To reclaim Anne's narrative is to broaden our understanding of what power looked like in her world. She was not merely the daughter of a kingmaker. She was herself a quiet architect of dynastic survival. She was not merely the widow of a slain prince or the wife of a controversial king. She was a queen who carried legitimacy, patronage, and stability in her very person. She was not merely a tragic figure doomed by fate. She was a resilient woman who made choices within narrow boundaries and whose presence mattered profoundly to the regime she served. In rethinking Anne Neville's story, we also challenge the ways we interpret other women of the late medieval era. How many others have been dismissed as passive simply because they left no letters or speeches behind? How many others shaped events through their counsel, their patronage, and their symbolic roles, only to be forgotten because their influence did not fit the loud, martial narrative that dominates our histories? By reclaiming Anne, we make space for these others as well, and we gain a richer, more nuanced understanding of the period. The final call, then, is to recognize Anne Neville in full, a woman of intelligence, resilience, and ambition who lived through some of the most violent decades of English history and left her mark even when the chroniclers tried to silence her. She was not simply Warwick's daughter, Edward of Westminster's bride, or Richard III's queen. She was a figure who endured forced marriages, who navigated political rivalries, who carried the burden of the crown, and who invested her hopes in the future of her son. She shaped the immediate fate of the Plantagenet dynasty and, in her quiet way, exemplified the strength that history too often ignores. Her story deserves to be heard in full, not as a footnote, not as a pawn, and not as a tragic shadow, but as a complex and ambitious woman who lived, chose,